Okay, thanks to all of you for joining us. It's great to see that so many people are with us today. And thanks also to the Burrenbeo Trust for inviting me to give this talk as part of its series of wonderful Wednesday webinars. I hope it will be a wonderful webinar, but we'll see how we get on. So to those of us with an interest in Ireland's native trees, the history of Scots pine is intriguing. Questions have long been asked about whether native pine exists in Ireland. Tonight, to attempt to answer some of those questions, I will present the findings of research by myself and others on the native status of Scots pine in Ireland. I'll start with a general overview of the ecology and history of the species in Europe and Ireland before focusing in on Scots pine in the Burren. This photograph was taken from the shore of Muckross Lake in Killarney National Park in County Kerry. Torc Mountain rises in the background, and it shows a stand of Scots pine or Pinus sylvestris alongside oak woodland. The Scots pine is instantly recognizable by its bluish green foliage and the distinctive reddish orange color of its bark. As you can see in this photograph, mature Scots pines have a characteristic outline with a flat crown on a long, bare, straight trunk. The Scots pine has a very wide global distribution. In fact, it is the most widely distributed pine species in the world. This map shows the natural distribution of Scots pine in Europe in blue. The native range of Scots pine covers approximately 2,700 kilometers from north to south, from above the Arctic Circle to the Sierra Nevada mountains of southern Spain. And it covers approximately 14,000 kilometers west to east, reaching from Scotland and Portugal across to Europe and Asia to the far east of Russia. Ecologically speaking, Scots pine is a pioneer species, meaning that it is quick to colonize previously disturbed habitats. As its wide geographic range suggests, it can tolerate an extraordinarily broad range of environmental conditions, from severe cold in northern Siberia to the Mediterranean climate of southern Spain, and from the wet oceanic climate of western Scotland to the dry continental climate of Central Europe and Asia. In terms of commercial importance, Scots pine is one of the most commercially important forest trees, particularly in the Nordic countries. Its timber is valued for its good strength to weight ratio. It is used in particular as construction timber and also for furniture, pulp, and paper. And it also lasts well in wet conditions. In terms of its nature conservation value, several types of Scots pine forest are considered to be of international importance for nature conservation, and they're protected under the European Union Habitats Directive. Just a few examples of these are bog woodlands, the Caledonian forests of Scotland, the lichen pine forests of Central Europe, the Western Carpathian pine forests of Eastern Europe, and the boreal forests of Scandinavia and Western Russia. To illustrate some of these habitats, here are some photographs I took during fieldwork in Scotland. This photograph is from the Caledonian Forest at Benea National Nature Reserve in northwest Scotland. And this one is of a bog pinewood at Abernethy National Nature Reserve in northern Scotland. Abernethy is the largest remaining remnant of pine forest left in the UK. And both of these habitats are priority habitats which receive the highest level of protection under the EU Habitats Directive. So they're extremely important. So there you have a broad overview of the importance of Scots pine. But what is the status of the species in Ireland? A species is defined as native or indigenous to a given region if its presence in that region is the result of only natural processes with no human intervention. To answer the question of native status, we must look to the end of the most recent ice age, which happened about 11,600 years ago. When most of us hear the word migration, we think mainly of people or perhaps birds or other animals like wildebeest rather than trees. But to survive climate change over the millennia, and particularly the ice ages, trees and plants have migrated across continents. As the climate warmed, the retreat of the ice uncovered a bare landscape. Plant species which had taken refuge in the southern latitudes of Europe began to migrate northwards to colonize this newly exposed ground, gradually moving through continental Europe and into Britain and Ireland. As I mentioned, Scots pine is a pioneer species. The fossil pollen record indicates that it was one of the first canopy tree species to colonize Ireland. It had arrived here by about 9,500 years ago, and it rapidly expanded its range, becoming widespread in Ireland. By about 7,500 years ago, it had become an important component of certain habitats, such as raised bogs, river valleys, and uplands. Indeed, Scots pine was the dominant tree pollen type in most western and upland study sites at that time. Scots pine also grew on the limestone pavement of the Burren. The preserved pine stumps, often excavated from our raised bogs and blanket bogs, provide unambiguous evidence of the former abundance of Scots pine in Ireland. The first time I encountered these preserved pine stumps was as an undergraduate student. I spent a summer in Connemara National Park working as a guide, fighting off the midges, and doing field research for my undergraduate thesis, which examined the effects of turf cutting on blanket bogs. I had to measure the depth of peat by pushing a probe down into a bog. The metal probe would ring when it hit the bedrock below, but every few meters when the probe went down, I would hear a thud instead of a ringing sound, and the probe would stop partway. There were pine stumps preserved in the peat below, and there were many of them. They represented the remains of an ancient pine forest that existed prior to the development of the blanket bog. Here's a photograph of one of these pine stumps, which had been exposed decades earlier by turf cutting. In a study by Professor Michael O'Connell of the National University of Ireland, Galway, these pine stumps were radiocarbon dated and found to be about 4,500 years old. While doing survey work more recently in Glenveigh National Park in County Donegal, I came across the remains of another extensive pine forest underneath a blanket bog. Pine stumps there have been radiocarbon dated to around 4,000 years old. And here's a photograph of a pine trunk. These are seen a lot less frequently than the stumps. This was excavated by turf cutting and has been exposed to the elements for a long time. However, I also came across some recently excavated pine stumps. The preservation was quite amazing. When you look closely, you can see fragments of bark still attached to the tree. A fire had burned through this pine forest before the trees were swallowed up by the developing bog, and you can see the blackening on the stump. I could still smell the charcoal from this ancient fire. And there were even preserved pine cones in the surrounding peat. Scots pine was widespread in Ireland and even dominated certain habitats until a massive decline of the species began around 4,000 years ago. The reasons are complex. The decline appears to have happened at different times in different parts of Ireland. It also appears to have been caused by a combination of different factors in different parts of Ireland. The tree species alder colonized Ireland and was able to outcompete Scots pine in lowland habitats, such as river valleys. Climate change is also likely to have played an important role as the climate of Ireland became wetter at this time. In upland areas and in the west, the expansion of the blanket bogs pushed Scots pine out of its former strongholds. Human activity would also have pushed the species further into decline as forests were cleared to make way for agricultural land. Scots pine would also have been particularly sought after for timber. The last known outposts of Scots pine were in the west of Ireland and on a raised bog in the Midlands. These late outposts included the Killarney Valley in County Kerry and Slishwood in County Sligo. In a study by Bill Watts of Trinity College, a pine stump from Gortleca in the Burren was radiocarbon dated to approximately 900 AD. However, Scots pine was widely believed to be extinct in Ireland at that time, and Watts was concerned that the radiocarbon date may be incorrect. The most recent unequivocal specimen, a preserved stump from Clonsas Bog in County Offaly, was radiocarbon dated to 400 AD. Scots pine was widely believed to have become extinct in Ireland at this point. Despite its apparent extinction, the question always remained, did Scots pine survive in Ireland in some unknown refuge? Native Scots pine woodland persists to the present day in Britain, but it is restricted to the Scottish Highlands. Scots pine had been reintroduced to Ireland by the mid-17th century, probably from Scotland. Richard Pocock noted a thriving population of 20,000 Scots pines near Carrick-on-Shore, County Tipperary in 1752. And in Killarney, County Kerry, around the year 1800, foresters were brought over from Scotland to work on the Kenmare and Herbert estates. Scots pine of Scottish provenance was planted extensively, and this was documented in the estate records. Since its reintroduction, Scots pine has been widely planted in Ireland. Under suitable conditions, it regenerates readily in Ireland, seeding in from plantations and naturalizing in a wide variety of habitats. Earlier in the 20th century, extensive plantations of Scots pine were established, but after 1945, more productive exotic species, especially Sitka spruce, became favoured for commercial forestry. According to the Forest Service, Scots pine is now regarded as semi-native within the Irish forestry sector and is Ireland's only native or semi-native conifer species with forestry potential. Yew and juniper would not be regarded as having forestry potential. In 2001, the Native Woodland Scheme was launched by the Forest Service. This scheme provides payments to landowners to support the restoration of existing woodlands and the establishment of new woodlands. One of the key features of the scheme is the requirement to plant native trees of genetic Irish provenance. Scots pine has been included in this scheme and so is being widely planted in native woodlands. Reintroduction is an important technique for ecological restoration. Notable examples include the successful reintroduction of the golden eagle, the white-tailed eagle, and the red kite to Ireland. However, reintroduction also presents a dilemma because it involves the introduction of non-native genetic material into natural ecosystems, which may not be well adapted to local conditions. Because of its presumed extinction and reintroduction, the native status of Scots pine in Ireland was disputed. As a result, there have been inconsistencies in our conservation and forest management policies in relation to Scots pine. As I mentioned, Scots pine was included in the Native Woodland Scheme, despite its uncertain native status at that time, and it is widely planted in native woodlands. On the other hand, the Irish Peatland Conservation Council regarded Scots pine on bogs as an invasive non-native species. So information was therefore required on the ecology of Scots pine in Ireland to clarify the implications of its reintroduction for biodiversity conservation. This sequence of extinction and reintroduction also occurred in other Northwestern European countries, including Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, England, and Wales. So the issues surrounding the uncertain native status of Scots pine are not limited to Ireland. To summarise, I'd like to draw this information together with a quote from the late Professor Bill Watts. He was an eminent paleoecologist who conducted the previously mentioned study at Gortlecha in the Burren. Why a very widespread species living in many kinds of habitat from Algeria to north of the Arctic Circle should have failed to survive in Ireland is mysterious, especially as pine survives in Scotland in habitats similar to those from which it disappeared in Ireland. It is difficult to imagine any form of burning or exploitation which would cause complete extinction. Further, planted pines thrive today in Ireland and invade natural habitats readily. The problem is a challenging and interesting one deserving further study. So there was a significant gap in the scientific knowledge regarding the native status of Scots pine and also its vegetation ecology in Ireland. New research was needed in order to fill these gaps and inform conservation and forest management policy. This provided the basis for my PhD research, which I completed between 2005 and 2010 at the Department of Botany, Trinity College, under the supervision of Professor Fraser Mitchell and Professor Steve Waldron. And one of the study areas that we looked at was the Burren. The Burren, as you all know, is well known for its rich natural and archaeological heritage. It's a stunning scenic landscape dominated by bare limestone hills in a mosaic of pastures, hazel scrub, turlochs, and exposed pavements of limestone bedrock. This landscape has been farmed for thousands of years. It's a botanical treasure trove with a unique and diverse flora. Unusually, plants typical of Arctic regions and high mountain ranges are found at sea level, side by side with species typical of the Mediterranean region. In spring and summer, bright blue gentians, fragrant orchids, and meadows full of oxeye daisies can be seen. At first, the bare limestone pavement appears inhospitable, but it's deceptive. The deep fissures in the rock are full of life, concealing a miniature woodland flora of holly and ferns. The Burren is full of surprises. As I mentioned previously, the Burren was one of the places where Scots pine was thought to have survived until a relatively late time. A present-day pine wood had come to the attention of my supervisors, and we decided that this area warranted further investigation. This is a photo of Rockforest. It's an open pine wood on limestone pavement with mature Scots pines seemingly randomly scattered through hazel scrub. The pines are stunted and gnarled in appearance. And due to this relatively natural appearance, we chose to study the ecology and environmental history of Rockforest in more detail, with a particular interest in the origin of its Scots pines. I won't go into great detail on this now, but I surveyed the vegetation of Rockforest wood. It's a type of pine wood vegetation found on limestone and characterized by the presence of hazel and wood false brome grass. It's quite similar to the pine woods on limestone found in Western Norway, and it's very species rich. If you're interested in vegetation ecology and you'd like more information on that, we published some papers describing the vegetation of Irish pine woods and comparing them with pine woods in Scotland and Norway. And these papers are listed below. The flora of the present-day woodland at Rockforest is diverse and includes many species typical of the Burren, such as the broad-leaved helleborine, which is one of Ireland's native orchids, the bloody cranesbill, which is a species of geranium, and the burnet rose, which is a common sight in the Burren. This is an aerial photo of the Rockforest site. Number 1 on the photo is Rockforest Loch. Number 2 is the location of Rockforest Wood. Number 3 shows Rockforest House, which was once part of the Rockforest estate. And number 4 is the road between Gort and Corrafin. So that's where we carried out our research. The methods that we used were those of paleoecology, which helps us to answer research questions regarding native status and environmental history. Palaeoecology is the study of past ecosystems. Fossil data are used to reconstruct interactions between different species and between species and their environment. Fossil pollen data can be used very effectively to reconstruct the history of woodland habitats. In order to better understand the history of the woodland at Rockforest, we took a small boat out onto Rockforest Loch nearby and extracted a tube full of muddy sediment from the lake. The sediment that slowly accumulates on lake beds contains pollen from the plants growing in the surrounding area. In this wet environment, which lacks oxygen, microbial activity is very low. The pollen grains are not broken down, but are almost perfectly preserved in the sediment. As the sediment builds up over thousands of years, an archive of fossil pollen develops. Different types of plants produce distinctive pollen grains, so by examining preserved pollen under a microscope, it's possible to identify the type of plant each pollen grain came from. By meticulously identifying and counting thousands of pollen grains taken from different depths in our sediment sample, it was possible to discover which plants grew in the Rockforest area in the past, their relative abundance, and how the vegetation changed over time. Radiocarbon dating was used to establish the timeline of our pollen record. This photograph shows a pine pollen grain under the microscope. It has a very distinctive outline. It looks a bit like Mickey Mouse. The pollen grain actually has two air bladders attached to it. This makes it very light and enables it to be dispersed on the wind over long distances. I've described the process of pollen analysis already, and the other analysis methods that we used were macrofossil analysis. Macrofossils are pieces of plant material, such as wood fragments, nutshells, and pine needles that are preserved in the sediment. While pollen can be transported over long distances, macrofossils from a given species confirm that that species was locally present. To establish our timeline, we used techniques including radiocarbon dating. And I also examined archival maps and the historical literature for information on woodland cover and human activity in the Rockforest area. This enabled me to build up a detailed reconstruction of the environmental history of Rockforest from 350 AD to the present day. Now, this is the pollen diagram for Rockforest. I realize that this may look off-putting if you haven't encountered one before, but pollen diagrams contain a wealth of information about the environmental history of an area. So if you're interested in this subject, it's well worth learning to read them. On this axis, you have the depth of sediment. The top represents the top of the core, which is the point where the lake sediment meets the water. The deeper down you go, the older the sediment. So as you look in this direction, if you follow my mouse cursor, I hope you can see it, you're going back in time down through the paleoecological record. And on this axis, you have the different types of pollen that were identified from the sediment. The fluctuating curves show how their frequency changes over time. And here are some familiar species like pine and hazel. And then on the right, you have summary curves where different types of pollen grains are grouped together. For example, the first curve shows all the tree pollen. And there are some key features on the pollen diagram that I want to point out to you. The first is to note that pine pollen is continuously present at high levels throughout the entire core between 350 AD to the present day. Hazel pollen is the next most frequent type, and grass pollen gradually increases over time. That's this one here. Cereal pollen, the grains cultivated for agriculture, such as wheat, oats, and barley, are present almost continuously at low levels. And the level of tree pollen is consistently high. And here are some key features on the diagram. There are high levels of tree pollen at the base of the pollen profile at 350 AD. This may represent the late Iron Age lull. This is a feature commonly seen in Irish pollen diagrams from this time, including several from the Burren. This was a period when human impact on the landscape was at a low level and forest regeneration occurred. And it's then followed by a reduced frequency of tree pollen, indicating increased human activity and farming. There's a small pine decline, reaching minimum values of 38% at around 650 AD. And a macrofossil, a preserved pine needle, was found at 850 AD. Now, the results of the analysis of maps and historical sources. Although the historical evidence is patchy in nature, the available archival maps and references in the historic literature point to a long history of woodland continuity at Rockforest. In the 14th century, the area formed part of a large woodland named Cuil ó Flancada, which is mentioned in the Annals of the Four Masters. The Grand Jury map of County Clare from 1787 depicts the area as wooded, and so do the Ordnance Survey 6-inch maps from 1840 and 1899. By 1808, tree planting had been undertaken on the Rockforest estate. Over 30 hectares had been afforested with several species, including Scots pine and exotic species. A finely planted domain extended nearly a mile along the road, but the pollen evidence indicates that Scots pine was present before this planting took place. Usually, Irish pollen records clearly show an absence of pine during the period of presumed extinction, with an increase in pine pollen following the species reintroduction. However, unusually at Rockforest, we found continuously high levels of pine pollen throughout our record. The presence of a Scots pine needle macrofossil at 850 AD confirms that the species was locally present. This suggests that a native population of Scots pine has survived at Rockforest, challenging the established view that the species became extinct in Ireland. The date of 850 AD is very close to Watt's date of 900 AD from nearby Gortleca. Pine was widely believed to be extinct in Ireland at that time, and Watts was concerned that his date was incorrect. This new evidence suggests that Watts' date may have been correct all along. The vegetation of the ancient woodland appears to have been dominated by pine and hazel, with a diverse ground flora similar to the woodland found at Rockforest in the present day. Indeed, studies of fossil pollen by other authors have shown that similar pine-hazel woodlands once dominated other parts of the Burren thousands of years ago. The consistently high level of tree pollen and the available historical evidence indicate that the Rockforest area has supported woodland continuously over the last 2 millennia. Some small fluctuations in woodland cover were recorded and probably resulted from human activity. A gradual rise in grass pollen was recorded, reflecting the increasing importance of pastoral farming in the Burren over the centuries. The representation of cultivated cereal pollen provides further evidence of agricultural activity. Other studies have shown that between 1700 and 1850 AD, much deforestation took place in the Burren due to the unprecedentedly high population and land use pressure prior to the Great Famine. Trees were so scarce in the Burren that people had to use bracken as fuel. This provokes the question, how could the woodland at Rockforest have survived during this period of deforestation? Rockforest was part of the Rockforest estate, which was owned by the Blood family during the 18th and 19th centuries. During that period, Ireland's landscape was heavily deforested except for woodland remnants that had survived within the old estates. It appears that Rockforest was one such estate. Following on from my work, additional research has been carried out at Rockforest. Dr. Alwyn McGeever completed a PhD at Trinity College, supervised by Professor Fraser Mitchell. She took a peat core from Aughrim Swamp, located on the northeast edge of Rockforest Loch. She conducted pollen analysis and radiocarbon dating. And here is an excerpt from that pollen diagram. On the right, you can see the pine signal from Aughrim Swamp. This record extends back to 350 AD, a similar time period to my own pollen diagram. And you can see that pine is continuously represented throughout. There is a decline, but it recovers again. 2 pollen analyses of the Rockforest area have now been completed by independent analysts at different sites using different sediment types. Both show a continuously elevated pine pollen signal. This strengthens the argument that a native population persists at Rockforest. Further research has been carried out by Dr. Colin Kelleher of the National Botanic Gardens. And he is looking at the genetics of Scots pine populations in Ireland. This work is ongoing, but preliminary results from 20 Irish populations suggest that 2 sites, one of which is Rockforest, have a different genetic signature to the background. While this doesn't conclusively mean that both are native, Colin is investigating this with more analyses. I'm sure the findings of his work are very eagerly anticipated. One other interesting potential avenue of research is the genetics of Scots pine populations in Scotland. Genetic research was conducted there in the 1990s and showed that two distinct populations existed, one in parts of the west coast of Scotland, the other in the remainder of Scotland. To explain this pattern, it has been hypothesized that following the most recent ice age, pine migrated to Scotland from two separate refuges. One is thought to have moved up through Central Europe, through England to Scotland. The other is thought to have migrated from the Iberian Peninsula to Ireland. This was at a time when sea levels were much lower and presented less of a barrier to migration than today. And it then colonized the extreme west coast of Scotland. It was not possible to test this hypothesis as pine was assumed to be extinct in Ireland, but now it would be fascinating to compare the Rockforest population with those of Western Scotland. So what conclusions can be drawn from this research? The results have important implications for woodland management in Ireland and for the conservation management of Rockforest itself. Due to the species' presumed extinction and reintroduction, the native status of Scots pine in Ireland was unclear. Two separate palaeoecological studies suggest that native pine has persisted to the present day at Rockforest, and these findings indicate that Scots pine should be considered as a native species in Ireland, at least at the Rockforest site. As the only potentially native population known in Ireland at present, the Rockforest pines are unique. This population represents the western limit of the species' global native range and is of high conservation value, but its rarity increases its risk of extinction. The population must be carefully managed and monitored to ensure its continued survival. And any seed sourcing undertaken at Rockforest must be compatible with the long-term viability of the population on site. So in light of this work, what is being done to conserve and protect Rockforest? Fortunately, Rockforest is part of the East Burren Special Area of Conservation, which is legally protected under the EU Habitats Directive. Most of the site is also part of the Burren National Park, which is owned by the state and managed for nature conservation by the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Rockforest has also been listed as a genetic conservation unit by the Forest Service. This means that it is a site which contains tree populations nationally designated for the conservation of forest genetic resources. Additional survey work has already been undertaken to map the extent of Scots pine at Rockforest and to investigate the structure of the population. Further habitat mapping and monitoring work is now underway, and this will inform a management plan for the site. While Scots pine is regenerating at Rockforest, seedlings and saplings are quite scarce, which is a serious concern for the future of the population. So I must emphasize that unauthorized seed collecting is not allowed within the national park without a permit. Limited seed collection is being carried out by a registered seed collector under a permit from MPWS, and this has allowed us to establish off-site populations of Rockforest pine at other MPWS sites as a sort of insurance to secure the future of the population. And the Burrenbeo Trust is also doing this through its Burren Pine project. Exciting research and conservation work is ongoing at Rockforest, and I'm sure that we will all eagerly await the results of this work, which I hope will shed further light on the history and origin of these fascinating trees and help to secure them for the future. I'd like to make the following acknowledgements, and thank you very much for listening.